21-day, 3-week program. We are in our third week and the third day of our module number 2 on national human rights institutions, courts, legal aid, and access to justice in India. We have first been introduced to national human rights institutions on the first day, introduced to what Paris principles are, and on the second day introduced to the various commissions in India, the various commissions like the national ones on human rights, women's rights, child rights, scheduled caste rights, etc. And the state human rights commissions as well. And then yesterday evening, you had that wonderful session with all the former chairperson and members explaining to you how they managed and what they did and how they did it. I'm sure you went back yesterday with a lot of hope that things can be done. It is not that things are bad. Things can be done. Things can be done differently and have been done differently in this country. So if we criticize because I know India can do it much, much, much better than in some of these institutions do. Now we are moving to the global institutions dealing with national human rights institutions. And you will see a presentation being made on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and their branch, the Global Institutional Alliance that we have, and the Asia Pacific Alliance that there exists. That is the presentation today. We cannot have a better person than Rosslyn Noonan with us today. You will see her, she's here. You will see why we have invited her, and you will also see why she accepted our invitation when I present to you her bio. Okay, Rosslyn Noonan is a national human rights institutions expert working with national human rights institutions across Asia and the Pacific. At the invitations of governments in this region and beyond, she has undertaken scoping studies on the feasibility of establishing a national human rights institution and has also advised governments on the establishment process. I recall to you, I mentioned the case of Taiwan in earlier sessions that we had, where she actually advised the government of Taiwan. In August 2018, she was appointed by the New Zealand government to chair an independent panel reviewing the New Zealand Family Court and related services. The report was delivered to the Minister of Justice on 31st May and released publicly on 16th June 2016. She was New Zealand's Chief Human Rights Commissioner for 10 long years, from May 2001 to August 2011. She also then chaired the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions from 2010 to 2012, which is known as the Global Alliance of National, which is known as GA-NHRI in short. For 5 years until December 2019, she was also the director of the Auckland University Center for Human Rights, Law, Policy, and Practice. Just like most of our people associated were also academics, here is an academic who has also been engaged in the National Human Rights Institution. This is to give a little hope to the academics who are present here. As a senior New Zealand trade unionist, and this is something unique, my dear friends, she was a workers' representative on the Bureau of ILO Standards Committee and was a member of the workers' negotiating team during the developments of the ILO Convention on the worst forms of child labor. Therefore, here we have not only somebody in academics, but also who was a workers' representative on different bodies. Born in Auckland, Rosslyn is an alumni of the Auckland University with a Master of Arts in Modern History. She spent 10 years of her childhood in Nigeria and the Congo, and this has a lot of value. A long-time women's rights, workers' rights, anti-racism advocate. She has extensive experience in the education sector, in the trade union movement, and in local government. Therefore, now you will understand why she's here and you will understand also why she accepted an invitation from all of us to be in our midst. Over to you, Rosslyn. You will do 20, then about 20, you know it, and then we take questions, and then we go on 3 times like that. And I'm sure all participants will be happy to raise the most difficult questions they have in their minds about national human rights institutions. And I know they will all get good answers from you. Over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Henry, and thank you very much for that introduction, and greetings, everybody. I'd wanted to start actually by thanking Henry and People's Watch for inviting me to participate in this terrific human rights education initiative. And I feel very honoured to play a small part in it. I want also a special salute from me to Henry, who I count as a friend and who I regard as one of the outstanding human rights defenders of our time. Now, Henry, were you going to put up the PowerPoint? Or was I supposed to do that?
We'll put it up.
You will, okay. So, yeah, so I think if we can go to slide 2. So just very briefly, and I just want to make a couple of comments. I mean, this is kind of a very introductory presentation, and I'm very happy for people to raise any questions, or I'm just not quite sure how it would work, but even interrupt at any stage. And I certainly hope that Henry will come in, you know, if he wants to underline a point or challenge me at any time. So the topics, I've divided it into 5, or that was what I was asked to do. So starting with national human rights institutions and their international dimension, and that's simply to give you a bit of a context for what we're covering. Then the introduction to GA-NHRI, APF, and the National Institutions Regional Mechanisms section of the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. Then we move to the international accreditation process, which is quite unique and quite special. Then national human rights institutions, international engagement. So how do they contribute at the international level? And finally, coming back to the domestic, I've really been invited to reflect on what I see as the critical elements that make for effective national human rights institutions. So that's what we're covering. And so if we go to that first slide on slide 3, sorry. And the reason why I wanted to provide this context is because I regard national human rights institutions as unique, but I accept that that needs to be justified. So what makes them unique? And I'm sure that Henry will have covered some of this himself, so I'm just doing a summary because it will help you understand how I think about national human rights institutions and how I relate them to the international and global environment. So just in summary, national human rights institutions are institutions of the state, but not of government. They're established, as you will have heard, either by constitution or by enabling legislation through parliament, and they're funded by government. Sometimes parliament funds them directly, sometimes the government funds them directly. And these issues, the establishment which can provide an independent legal framework, but the funding which suggests that the government still has a hook on them, is what makes their ability to act independently quite challenging. But the effective ones can and do, and they must not only, they must be independent, which is established in law, but they must be seen to be independent, and they must act independently in terms of the decisions they make, the issues that they pick up and pursue, the cases that they take. Now, the second point that I want to make is that national human rights institutions have an extraordinarily broad mandate. In fact, I don't think there isn't any other institution of the state that covers such a wide area. Most national human rights institutions, their mandate extends obviously to the state sector, the public sector, but also to the private sector, to the community sector. And human rights impact on every aspect of government work, for example. So it's not just limited, they're not just limited to one area. So they've got this very broad mandate. And then, and again, this is unusual, they're empowered to challenge and question not just the policies and practices of the government, but also the laws of the state, and to challenge those against the international human rights standards. They're the only institution of the state whose parameters were established by United Nations General Assembly resolution, and this is bringing us to the international element, the Paris Principles as we now know them. And it's the only institution of the state that is expected to report to the United Nations human rights mechanisms on their state's human rights performance. Even more exceptionally, they're the only institution of the state with independent status at the United Nations. If they're accredited A, and more about that later, if they're accredited A, they can speak in their own right. They don't have to be part of a government delegation. They don't have to have government approval at the Human Rights Council and all its related bodies. And in a sense, national human rights institutions have both national and international responsibilities and accountabilities. And that makes them unique. It also makes for a very challenging set of responsibilities. It's a huge job, for any national human rights institution anywhere. So if we just move to the next slide. So an introduction to GA-NHRI, APF, and the National Institutions and Regional Mechanisms section. And I want to touch on where did they come from, why and how did they develop, and their significance and impact. So first of all, a very short history, and again, this may well be a bit repetitive for you if Henry covered it in his sessions with you. But essentially, the development of national human rights institutions, their recognition at the international level can be said to date back to 1946, immediately post World War II, where the United Nations was developing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and very much focused on strengthening human rights around the world. And there was kind of an evolution from there through to 1960, where there was actually an ECOSOC resolution, and then a series of reports from what was in the Human Rights Commission, the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Then that process speeded up in the late 1980s, 1990s. And the question is why? Why did the international interest in establishing and strengthening national human rights institutions intensify during this period? And I suggest that there was a growing recognition that while the United Nations member states had done a remarkable job in codifying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the two covenants, in the two international covenants, and increasingly in human rights conventions that developed our understanding of what those rights meant in practice and when applied to particular groups, that there was very much a disconnect between what states said internationally as they negotiated these covenants, conventions, these covenants and conventions, and what they actually did at home. And all too often, and I can say this was true of New Zealand as well, we would see states ratify international human rights conventions, then they would go on the shelf. And honestly, when I became Chief Human Rights Commissioner, many senior public servants had no idea, had never looked at the international human rights conventions that New Zealand had ratified, didn't know how they applied or how they should be applying them into their areas of responsibility. So I think that growing recognition that it wasn't enough to negotiate a human rights treaty, it wasn't enough, although, and I just do want to emphasize again, I do think when you read them, they're remarkable achievements when you think of the huge diversity that is the membership of the United Nations, and that they could agree to the extent they did is quite, I mean, I think that's a source of hopefulness. But the question was, well, what was going to make a difference on the ground? And I think, again, another factor that was people were becoming more aware of was there was a sense that human rights was simply about the law. So if you ratified a covenant or convention, and then in one way or another, you incorporated that into your domestic law, that was it. But actually, we now know, or we grew to understand, particularly through the 90s, that while the law was important, and it was important to have good law, it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't at all sufficient, because often it was in policies and practices that people's human rights were most breached, most violated. The law might have been well-intentioned, but how it was implemented undermined those human rights principles and practices. So there was clearly a need to go beyond human rights simply as a legal concept. And it's interesting because, well, we haven't got time here now. This is another example of where, you know, a relatively small group of individuals, like-minded, can come together from around the world and really push for change. And essentially, this is what happened. And in 1991, there was an international workshop on national human rights institutions, and it included representatives from a number of national human rights institutions, not many, but a number that were already established. Interestingly enough, those like, say, Australia and New Zealand, for example, mostly had a sort of anti-discrimination mandate. They didn't have the broad human rights mandate, or they didn't interpret their mandate broadly. But at any rate, they came together, and it was actually at that workshop in Paris that the Paris Principles were drafted. And those went subsequently to the United Nations General Assembly in a resolution in December 1993 and were adopted. And so that's where you get, for this first time, an institution of the state, which the international community is pushing states to establish. And they're saying, and if you do establish one, these are the elements it needs to have for it to be credible and effective. Then that same year, also that same month, there was a second international workshop with national human rights institution representative participating, this time in Tunis. And they decided then to establish what they called then an international committee to coordinate the activities of national institutions. Its full name was the International Committee of National Institutions for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, the ICC. And actually, of course, you know, just on the side, the initials ICC actually were hopeless, because I had people say to me when I was chairing the ICC, wasn't that the International Cricket Conference or whatever, Cricket Council, or isn't it the International Chambers of Commerce? I was amazed at how many international organizations had initials that were ICC. So it's great that it's now called GA-NHRI. So throughout the 90s, what we see is, and indeed right through to today, what we see is the continuing evolution of GA-NHRI into, you know, an increasingly effective, more professional organization. But just some key points. GA-NHRI is a membership-based organization. It's not a development agency, and it's not, you know, a subsection of the United Nations. Today it has 110 members. So that's of national human rights institutions who are either A or B accredited. And its purpose from the beginning has been to bring together national human rights institutions for mutual support, to be able to exchange experience and expertise, and to support each other's development. And again, if I can just add a personal note, during my time as the New Zealand Chief Human Rights Commissioner, I learned the most useful things I learned were from other national human rights institutions, even though they might have seemed very diverse, you know, very different. Well, certainly their contexts were different, but it was amazing how common many of the issues were. And, you know, if I can just give you an example from, you know, right now, how many of the national human rights institutions now are grappling with family violence issue, right, almost everywhere. And so that was something that struck me, that, and far from human rights being something that was just a Western, you know, a Western development, actually, the people that I learned from most and were most challenged and inspired by were people like Seema Samar from the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, that, you know, who brought a totally different cultural, religious perspective, you know, came from and worked in an environment of conflict, huge underdevelopment, poverty. And yet, for her, human rights provided a foundation that should guide the development of a decent society. And it was interesting that when we, in New Zealand, when we took the Universal Declaration out into the community, how many people, when they read it, apart from the preamble, which is a bit, the language is a bit flowery and jargony, but the rest of it said, but this is just what we need for a decent, you know, this represents the key elements of a decent society where everybody has an opportunity to flourish. So in terms of, you know, GA-NHRI, it does provide, and because these positions are so challenging, and I have to say so unique, they can be very lonely as well. So it's an opportunity to come together with your peers and get, as I say, get support and guidance. GA-NHRI has also, I mean, I think in a sense, the most significant thing it's done has been to develop the accreditation system, which is a peer-to-peer review. And I'm going to come, to that shortly. But it is unique, and it's the only accreditation system that the United Nations recognizes for participation in the United Nations that it doesn't control. And the other thing is GA-NHRI is the collective voice of national human rights institutions at the United Nations. And again, because we don't have a lot of time without going into a lot of detail, but a couple of examples that might be interesting. And the first one, India played a significant role, and that was the Indian Commission contributed to the advocacy, first of all, for getting states to agree to the development of a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, and then actually getting support from member states for national human rights institutions to be represented in the negotiating process at the United Nations. And I would like to suggest that having national human rights institutions formally participate in the negotiation process is one of the reasons why that most recent of international human rights conventions is such a stunning document. And GA-NHRI, there was, coordinated that participation, encouraged it, and provided support to the members' institutions, not just in New York at the negotiations, but by providing information and so on back to them that they could use to advocate to their government delegations at home, and to reinforce the importance of their support for the process. The second one was the development of, through the Human Rights Council, of the guiding principles on business and human rights. And again, the engagement of national human rights institutions, I think, resulted in those guiding principles being much more practical and able to be implemented and more widely accepted than it would have been without the voices of national human rights institutions. And the thing is, these are often quite complex issues. And so what GA-NHRI was able to do at the global level was provide a focal point for us to have those discussions amongst ourselves as we developed our positions. But I'd just like to also add here, to be quite clear, that GA-NHRI does not impose any position on any member. And it's been very important, and again, I recollect from my early days at the New Zealand Commission, that the Indian representatives from the Indian Commission were always very clear that while sometimes we speak collectively, we only speak collectively on behalf of those members who specifically agree. So you'll see, for example, at the Human Rights Council, that there'll be a statement from GA-NHRI or from APF, but it'll list which member institutions have agreed to that statement. So the independence of national human rights institutions extends to their participation with their peers, with their colleagues at the international level. Interestingly enough, and I mean, I mention this because this is a very rapid overview, but when the Human Rights Council, it succeeded the Human Rights Commission in the 2000s, when it was reviewed towards the end, well, anyway, it was reviewed, must have been maybe beginning 2010 when I was chairing GA-NHRI. We were advised at that stage, national human rights institutions could speak on only particular agenda items at the Human Rights Council. And we were advised that we should, keep our heads down, because this review would potentially seek to limit the participation of national human rights institutions at the Human Rights Council. Well, it's never been my approach to keep your head down. Certainly be strategic, be thoughtful, but don't fear engagement. And ultimately, the members of GA-NHRI supported the APF, at the time, the APF recommendation that we should campaign to enhance the participation of national human rights institutions at the Human Rights Council. And as a result, national human rights institutions were the only group that made gains during that review. And I mention this because actually they were really important gains. So first of all, that national human rights institutions could have, with accreditation, could have speaking rights on any agenda item of the Human Rights Council. Secondly, and from my perspective, this was incredibly important, we could make video statements. We didn't have to go to Geneva at all of that expense and cost and time, and people from our region in particular, from the Asia Pacific region, could you justify going to Geneva in order to make a 3-minute statement and all of the expense involved? And so we gained approval for video statements. And I think the thing about it was incredible. I think it was, if I'm recalling correctly, I think it was first of all, the providor from the Timor-Leste Providor's office, which is the National Human Rights Institution in Timor-Leste, who made the first statement. The impact at the Human Rights Council was considerable, because it's right up there on the big screen. It's kind of better than the impact is almost greater than sitting at the back, reading your speech there. And and subsequently, and very soon after, I think the chair of the South African Human Rights Commission made a very important statement on food security, and so on. So this is a tool which I think should be used more. But one of the benefits of it was that as the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commission staff became more confident of the use of video statements, they've slowly begun extending those, for example, to small island nation states who also can't afford to travel to Geneva, most of whom don't have representation there, and so on. So I think it's like opening up. I regarded it as opening up the Human Rights Council, to real life beyond Geneva. So, and in the case of special procedures, we gained the right, when a special procedure, special rapporteur makes a report, a country report. What used to happen was the report was made and received, then the state about whom the report was made a statement, and then any other states that wanted to speak, they spoke next. And then if there was any time left, a national human rights institution, the national human rights institution from that state could speak, and then civil society representatives. And we gained the right to speak immediately after the state. And again, I witnessed that at the working group on Indigenous peoples' rights, I think it is. And it makes for a much better debate, a much better discussion of the issues, instead of just the formal states, sort of statements that often fudge the issues. So this is the sort of thing that GA-NHRI does. Supports members, to come together and to build capacity to be effective in promoting and protecting human rights, but also is their voice at the Human Rights Council and in the international arena. And just very briefly to finish off on, so you understand how GA-NHRI works. So the members elect a bureau. The bureau has 4 representatives from each of the 4 regions. So the 4 regions are Africa, the Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe. And there's also a chair and a vice chair or secretary of GA-NHRI. So, and that executive or bureau deals with the day-to-day decisions such as there are. There's a very small staff now at GA-NHRI. When I was chair, there was only 1 staff member employed. GA-NHRI had virtually very little funding at all, very little outside funding, just its membership fees, which aren't very high. So, you know, I think it's done remarkably on very, very limited resources. And civil society representatives are always present now at GA-NHRI conferences and annual meetings. And when there's a panel at one of these GA-NHRI global meetings, I would say 9 times out of 10, a civil society representative will be part of that panel. So that gives you a brief sort of look at GA-NHRI. So the Asia Pacific Forum is one of the 4 regional secretariats that support the members in their region. The Asia Pacific Forum currently has 25 members, and they stretch from the Palestinian Independent Human Rights Commission on the edge of the Mediterranean, right through to the Samoan Ombudsman's Office in the South Pacific. So our region, the region of which you are part, has got the greatest diversity of any region in terms of legal systems, languages, cultures, religion, everything. You know, systems of government. Very, very diverse. So so the fact that all of those very different, all of those national human rights institutions from very different contexts can come together and work together and support each other is quite remarkable. What else can I tell you? So like GA-NHRI, and probably on a more in-depth and regular extended basis, the APF supports the development of members, sharing of expertise and experience, offering or developing with members programs, for example, to develop people's human rights education capacity, institutions' human rights education capacity, or to develop facilitation skills in the staff of national human rights institutions that are working on education. That's, you know, just one example. Similarly on investigations, education investigations, I'm just trying to think some of the other things they've developed, guidelines now to support members developing strategic plans, which are really critical. Simply because, I mean, a strategic plan is important because no national human rights institution is resourced sufficiently to do everything, to deal with every human rights issue that comes before them. So the development of a strategic plan in consultation with the wider community, where agreement can emerge about what are the key priorities and what are the systemic issues, that should be the focus of the next, say, 3 to 5 years, is critical to ensure that actually the work of a national human rights institution isn't purely reactive, that it is proactive, and it does focus on systemic change and how to impact that change. I want to acknowledge as well that APF has been a driving force in the development of GA-NHRI, and in particular in ensuring that the accreditation process becomes increasingly robust. So, I mean, it's interesting, I think our members, in Asia Pacific, we're the only one of the 3 regions, of the 4 regions, that doesn't have a regional intergovernmental human rights mechanism. And I guess as a result, we've put a lot of energy into trying to strengthen the framework in which national human rights operate at the global level through GA-NHRI. The other thing is that APF, since its very beginning, has always involved, not necessarily perfectly, but has always involved civil society organizations, and and encouraged members to have a good working relationship with non-governmental organizations, well, with non-governmental organizations that have a human rights focus at the national level. This is still very much a work in progress, but I do want to acknowledge the role that Forum Asia, and specifically Forum Asia ANI, has played in maintaining that relationship through ups and downs, and in working constructively with APF to try to find ways to strengthen the relationship between national human rights institutions and civil society organizations. And that just brings me to the section. I hope I'm not talking too quickly.
No, you're okay. You're perfectly okay.
Okay, so, and that's the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, and specifically, but I'll talk more generally initially, the National Institutions Regional Mechanisms section. If you think back to the little bit of history that I provided at the beginning, the 1990s was a period of suddenly rapid development, or rapid interest in the development, in the establishment of national human rights institutions. And I credit a lot of that to Mary Robinson when she was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, because I think more than anyone else, she realized that it was no good to be preaching to states from the outside. And some of you might be aware that at that time in the 1990s, for example, people like the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, was saying, you know, universal human rights, no, there's no such thing. There's Asian values, that's what's relevant here. And that was, you know, quite a common perspective. And I think Mary Robinson realized that there was no point trying to lecture people, which is always, in my view, always hopeless at any rate, but that human rights would only be strengthened domestically if there were voices domestically, if there were an institution of the state that was dedicated to focusing on human rights, to robust analysis of law, policy, and practice, but also, and I think really critically, to showing how human rights were relevant in their own context. So not, you know, simply picking up examples from outside. And so she put a priority within the Office of the High Commission on supporting the development, the establishment of national human rights institutions. And we saw a considerable number, during that period, established during that period. And part of what she did was establish what was, first of all, it was the National Human Rights Institutions Office. And then during various restructurings within the office, it's become the National Institutions and Regional Mechanisms section. But that was there to support GA-NHRI and the regional secretariats. And for a period, the office provided funding for the annual GA-NHRI conferences, and they provided much of the logistical support for organising the annual meetings and then the biennial and then triennial conferences. And similarly, for a period, they funded, for example, APF's annual meetings, or they funded the participation of some members to those annual meetings. So for a period during the 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights was very key to supporting the establishment and strengthening of national human rights institutions. Of course, the office also engages with national human rights institutions at the national level where there are OHCHR representatives based. And again, if I look around currently, I would say, for example, in Central Asia, so that's the 5 stans, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, combined with the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, are working incredibly constructively to develop the ombudsman's offices in those republics as, truly national human rights institutions. And when you see the office working effectively, it does have an impact. But like any institutions, it's not perfect. And I think certainly from my perspective, it has, its support for national human rights institutions is not as effective now as it once was. And I think that is a pity. But things change, and hopefully that will change. During the time that I was chairing GA-NHRI, so this is like 2010, 2011, the UNDP administrator at the time was Helen Clark, and Nave Pillay was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we were able to come together and actually sign a memorandum of understanding, which formed a tripartite agreement at that time to support, consult and engage with national human rights institutions in all of the work that UNDP and the Office of the High Commission was doing. And again, in recognition that national human rights institutions were, in most cases, again, however imperfect we all were, really were the experts in their own places about human rights issues. And and we were trying to develop, because there was such variation between the support in different countries that were given by both the Office of the High Commission and the UNDP, and we were trying to ensure that that there was some equality in support wherever the National Human Rights Institution was. So actually, like Mary Robinson, I think Helen Clark and Nave Pillay, during their terms of office, did value the role of national human rights institutions, did see their potential, and did seek to find ways to make that very, bureaucratic organization that is the United Nations see it too and engage more effectively. So I think, I think that's about it now for those ones. So if I just move on to the next slide, thank you. I don't know where is it? Yeah. And so this is about the accreditation process. Let's just get my notes, sorry. I mentioned earlier that the GA-NHRI accreditation process for national human rights institutions is absolutely unique. It is the only accreditation process that the United Nations recognizes that it doesn't control itself. The Office of the High Commission, the National Institutions and Regional Mechanisms section provides the secretarial services, but the decisions that are made by representatives from each of the regions, each of GA-NHRI's regions. So as part of GA-NHRI processes, each region nominates a member organisation to be on the subcommittee on accreditation. And currently, the subcommittee is chaired by the French National Human Rights Institution, and the Asia Pacific representative is Chito Gascon, who is the chair of the Philippines Human Rights Commission. And they meet, so the GA-NHRI Subcommittee on Accreditation, it meets currently twice a year, although because of COVID-19, the it usually meets in March and then either late October or November. Because of COVID-19, the March session has been postponed. And the process is that that a national human rights institution, when its first annual report, it can seek accreditation. Every 5 years, accredited national human rights institutions have to reapply to be reaccredited. And those institutions that are B accredited, so that those ones which the GA-NHRI Subcommittee on Accreditation finds do not fully meet the Paris Principles, they can reapply whenever they feel changes have occurred that, justify them being reaccredited, and preferably A. So that's the process. Both GA-NHRI and APF allow national human rights institutions observer status before they're accredited. So new national human rights institutions can participate in GA-NHRI and APF meetings before the accreditation process. And in the case of APF provides substantial support to a national human rights institution seeking accreditation. The process involves submitting a very lengthy case. There's a form that you have to fill out, and you have to provide copies of the legal framework, the law, the constitution, the law, etc., any regulations that apply, and a whole raft of other elements As I'm sure Henry will have covered, the Paris Principles, for example, require adequate resourcing of a national human rights institution so that it can operate independently. You have to be able to demonstrate your independence, and a whole raft of other aspects of the Paris Principles. The Subcommittee on Accreditation has deadlines. So if you're going to be, for example, in the October or November session for accreditation or reaccreditation, a deadline is set. I think it's now, I should have double checked this. I'm pretty sure it's now like 4 months before that the National Human Rights Institution has to submit its application. And this, of course, is because aspects, it may need to be, aspects may need to be translated. There may need to be double checks on some of the information that's been submitted. Before that, civil society organizations are also able to submit. And when they submit their analysis or their report on a national human rights institution that's coming before the Subcommittee on Accreditation, that is given, a copy of that is given to the National Human Rights Institution so they can reply to the subcommittee about any of the issues that are raised by civil society. And I want to emphasize here that a number of our members across Asia Pacific have felt that the Asia Pacific National Human Rights Institutions are at a disadvantage when it comes to accreditation because civil society in our region is much, much more active. It would be very rare not to have civil society submissions in relation to a national human rights institution that's going before the Accreditation Committee. And again, I'd say Forum Asia ANI has played a very significant role in encouraging that participation. I'm also conscious that civil society organizations find aspects of it quite frustrating. But I think on the whole, my own perception is that on the whole, if anything, the process has got more robust and fairer over the years. It's strengthened. I mean, some national human rights institutions that got A's back in the early 2000s would not get an A now, that's for sure. And I'm thinking particularly of the European ones, the Danish Institute, for example, though it's developed so that it now better meets the Paris Principles, or the German Institute, similarly, which were basically, in the case of the German Institute, basically a research body, didn't actually, fulfill most of the functions of a national human rights institution as we know and experience them. So as well as the initial accreditation, reaccreditation process, there is also provision for a special review. And again, I'm not really the expert on this. I think probably Henry is, but as a result of, so the GA-NHRI Subcommittee on Accreditation had developed a process of listing significant issues raised by the accreditation process, and then saying that it would review that particular national human rights institution within 2 years rather than within 5 years. And when this happened with respect to India, the Indian Commission challenged that process in court, according to, saying it wasn't provided for in GA-NHRI's rules, and the court found, in the Swiss court where GA-NHRI is legally registered, found in there the Indian Commission was correct. But there's still the potential for special reviews when something has substantially changed, or when there's been an action by a national human rights institution that has a major action that has been in serious contravention of the Paris Principles. There can be a call for a special review, which can be requested by a civil society organisation. Doesn't mean it will automatically follow, but can be requested. It can be the GA-NHRI can refer a matter to the subcommittee for review, etc. So that's the process, and I think there are limitations in terms of the Paris Principles, because if you look at them, while they talk about ways of working, methods of operations, and they've got some clear guidelines there, for example, that the National Human Rights Institution must hear from anyone. In other words, it's got to be accessible to people. It's got to work with non-governmental organisations, and so on. They were developed in early 1990s. And there's nothing that really in them speaks to what impact is a national human rights institution having. So in a sense, and we all, I have to say, I've observed this, and I'll use the Palestinian and the Afghan Commission as examples. I think these, in my experience and observation, these have been outstanding national human rights institutions operating in incredibly difficult circumstances. The Paris Principles requires that they be, that governments fund a national human rights institution, at least provide the core funding. In both cases, they were accredited A without their governments providing core funding. This was regarded as exceptional, and it is exceptional, but I think in both cases absolutely justified. And I mean, I think ironically, in both cases, had the governments provided core funding at the time, when they were first accredited, they would have exercised very negative control over those national human rights institutions, and that in that instance, that government funding would have inhibited their effective performance and their independence. But that is very much the exception. And on the whole, I mean, if anything, I mean, I've been concerned that government funding hasn't kept up in the way that it should in many instances for national human rights institutions. But the GA-NHRI recommendations can help push governments, particularly to strengthen the law. And of course, there's a famous example from our region in relation to Suhartoqom, which is the Malaysian Human Rights Commission. And
they're here this afternoon.
What?
They are with us this afternoon.
Oh, okay. Well, then I won't go into the details. So you'll hear the story this afternoon.
You can tell the details because they can ask a question to Gerard. Gerard is going to be here.
Oh, great. Yeah. So the Malaysian National Human Rights Institution went through, I think it was its it had been accredited. It was an A, and then it went through its reaccreditation process. And the subcommittee determined that for a number of reasons, not least of which was that the term of office of the commissioners, which was only 2 years, which was completely hopeless, that term of office was too short, and that without changes to the legal framework of Suhartoqom, it would be downgraded to B. And the process allows a year. So you don't lose your A accreditation. You've got a year to get it sorted. And initially, of course, the members of SUHACM were pretty upset about that because it wasn't their fault. I mean, this is the thing. There's a number of things that really are the state's responsibility, but the subcommittee takes the approach that the National Human Rights Institution must advocate for these changes and show that it's done everything in its power to achieve them. So after being very disappointed and a bit grumpy, the SUHACM commissioners took a deep breath and they went to work on their government and they got the changes. And I mean, that really the changes they achieved have really strengthened that commission. But there's a bit of a sad, unfortunate ending to this for them. So I've got huge respect for those commissioners. And what the government then did was, when it introduced the law to meet the Paris principles, it also introduced law that said none of the existing commissioners could be reappointed. So, I mean, governments everywhere, it's not just in Malaysia, because there's a case in New Zealand where the New Zealand Commission took a case through the courts, one at every level, and then the government of the day legislated under urgency against the court's decision. So, it's a never-ending job, but the accreditation process is something to be nurtured and protected, but also to continue developing. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And it just needs to be open to continuing improvements in the process. I do want to say also that when I was the chair of GA-NHRI, I got huge pressure from governments who wanted to participate in the accreditation process. And so I think that's always something to take into account. I was told, and this was at the time of the review of the Human Rights Council, and I was told, they wouldn't support the changes that I was, that GA-NHRI was looking for through the review process if we didn't agree to them being able to participate in the accreditation process. But we managed to resist that, thank goodness, and they did all that. Well, a majority of them did support the changes that we were after. So, perhaps if I stop there, hand over to Henry for any questions and also comments, and everybody can, maybe have a 2-minute break.
Rajavel, your domain?
Yeah. So there were around 10 questions, and I'm picking 2 or 3 important ones and very specific ones. The first is regarding GA-NHRI, and so the question is, how did GA-NHRI gain acceptance from many countries as an independent body providing accreditation? And the second one is regarding the accreditation process, and the participant wants to know what is the criteria for ranking the national human rights institutions. And also a follow-up question on how this accreditation process has helped national human rights institutions constructively in reforming the institution themselves.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch this. What was the second one? So I've got, how did GA-NHRI gain acceptance from governments for the accreditation process?
The second one is regarding the criteria for ranking in the accreditation process.
Right.
And also how this accreditation process itself has helped constructively in reforming the NHRIs.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the first one, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. How did GA-NHRI gain acceptance? I tell you what, I do think the fact that in those early years, the leadership at the Indian Human Rights Commission was very active and supportive of GA-NHRI. And I think just before I was appointed chair at New Zealand, I think before that, India had chaired the ICC and had done it terrifically. So I think having, you know, my own view is that one of the factors was the leadership provided by the Indian Human Rights Commission in the very early days that was able to provide a lot of the a lot of countries across Asia, Africa, with confidence, you know, and reassurance about the process, so that this wasn't, you know, just a Western-dominated imposition of a Western view of human rights. I think that was a factor. I think also that certainly at the APF level, I mean, our founding members, the APF's founding members were obviously India, Australia, Philippines, and Indonesia, I think, and New Zealand. So, so the Philippines and Indonesia were also, you know, they were also very influential voices, and the national human rights institutions at that time, you know, engaged very effectively with their governments, persuading their governments that of the advantage of this approach. Yeah, I mean, I think that I really do feel that was part of it, and because I know myself from, you know, when I was advocating on behalf of GA-NHRI at the time of the Human Rights Council review, it made a big difference about, you know, who I could call on from our member organizations to support the position. So yeah, so I think but I would give a lot of credit to the Indian Commission of that particular time for that, for building the confidence of the non-aligned states in particular in what was being proposed. But also, I think, can I just say one other thing? I do think this whole evolution of national human rights institutions and the way they've become recognized is down to some extent, very committed people, you know, campaigning, organizing, pulling allies together and persisting. Which is why you know, one of the reasons why I never feel completely pessimistic, because, you know, it's quite extraordinary. It's a bit like I said earlier about the you know, the quality of the international covenants and conventions when you consider the environment in which they're negotiated. That if we really put our mind to it and we organize properly, we can have an impact. In terms of the criteria, so there's just two rankings, A or B. And I always say that A is that you're meeting the minimum requirements of the Paris Principles. I mean, some say it's when you're, you know, that it means you're fully compliant. Well, you have to be, you know, more or less compliant. But yeah, and B is if you're not compliant in an identified area. So if I can give you an example, the Maldives Human Rights Commission, well, in the past, not the recent commission, but previously, that was a very effective, committed national human rights institution who did have a real impact, and hopefully will again soon. But they could never be A accredited, even though they were doing really good work, because under their constitution, only Muslims could be appointed as commissioners. So effectively, the religious discrimination applying at that level meant that they were always going to be a B unless that was changed. You know, and in their case, obviously, because the politics within the Maldives deteriorated, that wasn't changed. I mean, it'd be interesting now, I think, you know, with the current government and the current parliament, it would be interesting to see whether it's probably not at the top of anybody's priorities at the moment in the Maldives, but there's the potential, you know, for that to be changed. And the things that they look at, you know, they look very closely at the legal framework. So does it provide for independence? And there's a variety of ways. So, you know, as well as providing whatever an appropriate guarantee of independence is in that particular national context, and you know, and it varies a little bit from whether there's a statement in the law that the members of the commission must act independently in all they do, or whether there's another, and some have another statement as well that says that no one may apply any pressure on the National Human Rights Institution in carrying out its duties. There's a variety of kind of different wording, but the issue of independence is critical, and it's judged not just by those clear-cut statements, but it's judged also by the term of office. And this is, you know, where you come back to Suhartoqu, where, you know, the issue was 2 years is not long enough for people to feel confident to be independent. You know, really, actually, I think a minimum term is 4 years. I think 3 years is not enough either. 4 years with the right of, you know, reappointment once. Or in the case of the Philippines Commission, it's a 7-year term. So there's enough time for people to, and also because they're not going to be reappointed, you know, they really are, they can be confident to do what they think is right. But independence is also judged by, you know, the appointments process. So the Subcommittee on Accreditation argues that the appointments process should be open and transparent and should involve civil society representatives. There's a variety of appointments processes. My own view has always been there's no one perfect one. I mean, I think the subcommittee, partly as a result of the views within the Office of the High Commission, thinks that parliamentary appointments are the superior ones. But most parliaments, as you will know, are made up of the different political parties. They don't, you know, and the government has a majority in the parliament. Most governments have a majority, or there's a coalition. So it's not, parliament's not inherently any more, less partisan than other forms. So that's why I think the process for the appointment, calling for nominations from across the country, setting out clear criteria of what you need in order to be able to serve as on the commission is important. And then there's issues like, you know, are they the resource levels? And I've talked a little bit about that using Afghanistan and Palestine as an example. There are issues about, you know, whether they have delivered on the mandates that's required of them, that's laid out in the Paris Principles and in the human rights, and in the human rights standards. I mean, you know, the issue of mandate is important. So do they have a broad human rights mandate to cover civil and political as well as economic, social and cultural rights? And and this is very important, do they have both promotion and protection powers? Because promotion is often, you know, so that's the whole education, awareness raising, etc. That's often the weak spot of a national human rights institution. A lot of that in the past, it's been a lot more emphasis on the complaints handling rather than the other activities. So those are some of the things. If you look, you can go online and look at the Subcommittee on Accreditation reports, and you'll see the sorts of things that come up, you know, and some of them come up quite frequently. The appointments process is one. The issue of sufficient resourcing so that they can operate independently. The issue of their mandate, whether it does cover all human rights or if it's limited. The issue of whether it covers everyone within the boundary, within the borders, or just, you know, or just citizens, which has been a limitation in some places. So those are the sorts of criteria that are used in assessing, you know, the accreditation levels. And, you know, the thing about how it helps a national human rights institution is that it provides, I mean, I think the accreditation recommendations provide national human rights institutions with a strong argument to take to their governments, either to strengthen the law or to improve the resources, you know, or, you know, whatever else they're recommending. Because although governments may complain about them, in reality, in my experience is governments really, really want their national human rights institutions to be accredited. So if the subcommittee recommendations are sufficiently, you know, if there are those that are oriented to actions the state must take, it is quite a powerful advocacy tool for that national human rights institution. And I think it's also, they can also be quite a powerful advocacy tool for civil society involvement with the national human rights institution. And some of the recommendations or observations that the national human rights the subcommittee makes, you'll find very similar to what the Forum Asia ANI annual reports about that national human rights institution have said in the past.
Ajwal?
Yeah, just one more question. So is GA-NHRI accreditation process and the UPR process related?
Not directly, no, not directly, but the UPR process can be used to encourage governments to take action recommended by the Subcommittee on Accreditation. And you do see that sometimes. So that's, you know, it's one of the things that the UPR can draw on.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to turn on the lights here because it's getting dark now.
Rosslyn, you're finished on your side?
Yep, I'm good. Okay. I'm just turning on the lights so I don't feel I'm sitting in the dark as dusk has descended here. Okay, so shall we just move quickly to the last two slides then?
I think a little fast because I think participants might want to leave at 10:30, so a little fast on that if you don't mind.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, we really should be winding up, shouldn't we? So this is very quick. What I've quoted here is is what the Paris Principles say about NHRI's international engagement. So it's both nationally to promote international human rights within the state, but it's also to contribute to reports to United Nations bodies and committees, and to cooperate with United Nations with the United Nations and organizations within the United Nations system. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So the main areas of expected engagement with the United Nations are those that relate to the United Nations Human Rights Council. So we've talked just briefly about the Universal Periodic Review. Very quickly, an A-accredited National Human Rights Institution may submit a report on at the time of their state's Universal Periodic Review. If they're A-accredited, that report is presented in whole. If they're B accredited, or they're not accredited at all, their comments are incorporated with the civil society comments. I've already mentioned that national human rights institutions may participate on any agenda item at the council sessions. And I also think one of the really valuable things that national human rights institutions do is offer side events during Human Rights Council sessions. And finally, there's the United Nations Human Rights Council has a variety of working groups and called by a variety of different names. And so again there, if the working group is dealing with issues that are relevant to that National Human Rights Institution, the National Human Rights Institution may choose to engage with it. And in most instances, you can engage by putting in written submissions, as well as making a speech, if you're able to do that in person. And GA-NHRI offers to deliver on behalf. I mean, that's one of the services they provide, that they can, if you want to have a speech made at a session, a GA-NHRI representative, a GA-NHRI staff member in Geneva can do it on your behalf if you're not able to be there. I think really important is the participation of the human rights treaty bodies, and this is where submitting parallel reports or commenting on the reports that the government has submitted adds incredible value. And I won't go into any details except to say that what I've seen and experienced personally is that when a national human rights institution, provides a robust report to a treaty body and says these are the issues you should be concentrating on, and these are the sort of recommendations that would be most helpful, 9 times out of 10, the treaty body takes them aboard. And I've observed, at least in the New Zealand case, that those treaty body reports then become much more useful to the National Human Rights Institution in terms of advocating for change, and because they tend to reflect more the realities on the ground in a particular country, often the governments are more accepting of them. And because I've seen too often where governments were able to sort of dismiss treaty body or some part of a treaty body report because the treaty body had made an error, didn't know enough about some aspect, and then they use that to dismiss the whole report. So I think contributing to the treaty body's examinations of their state is really, really important. You don't have to write whole reports. You can just highlight the key issues that you regard as important. And finally, in terms of the regional human rights mechanisms, and maybe you've got another session on this, but again, because across Asia Pacific there's not a single regional human rights mechanism. The one that's most often identified is the Asean Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission, and there unfortunately, there's still some way to go before that Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission recognises the value of input from national human rights institutions as a whole. They're happy for individual members to consult with their national human rights institution at the national level, but they haven't engaged with them. They won't engage with them at the regional level at this stage. And finally, very quickly, the last.
Rajul, lastly.
Yeah, so this is, yeah. So I was asked just to comment on what I see as important in strengthening domestic human rights protections. And again, we have run out of time now to elaborate on these, but I think, you know, national human rights institutions can use the UPR and treaty body recommendations to strengthen their own advocacy. So that's a value, you know, so that the international engagement is kind of like a virtuous circle. But then at the more practical level, personally, I think being accessible to everybody, treating complainants and victims, and particularly those from communities that are most marginalized, with dignity and respect, that, you know, I think is almost the number one thing, because so many people in our countries are never treated with dignity and respect by any official agency, and the National Human Rights Institution is their last resort, and the difference it can make in people's lives just to be listened to and, you know, and supported and treat, as I say, treated with dignity and respect. I've touched already on the fact that I think over commitment to individual complaints and too much of the resources going into handling individual complaints can undermine the ability to have a real impact on and make changes. Therefore, it's critical to identify human rights priorities through a consultative process and to agree to focus on some key systemic issues over a period of time. And finally, developing relations with civil society organisations to expand the work of the commissions of NHRIs is, you know, is obvious, but somehow, for some reason, most of our NHRIs still have some difficulty with that. So I'm sorry to have run over time a little bit, but there you go, a quick wind up.
Any questions are there?
No questions there.
No questions. Okay, I will ask you a question, Rosslyn. I would love asking a question because I learn so much every time I listen to you. And this question is by special countries like India, where you have different national human rights institutions, which are very important for us in our national scenario, as you know, which work on women's rights, minority rights, Dalit rights, and you know them. We have 9 of them at the national level and about 160 at the state level. I'm not worrying you with the 160 at the moment. The national institutions here are national human rights institutions. And how is it that we could, from outside, a body like APF or GA-NHRI, send an invitation letter to these people to consider becoming members of GA-NHRI or APF, so that our commissioners, chairpersons and commissioners will become trained, they will have access to all the training that APF provides, perhaps also have sometimes opportunities of traveling to other meetings, etc. And their outlook would change, as a result of which we would see changes on the ground. What do you think of the proposal of this sort?
Well, I think, you know, there's 2 barriers at the moment. One is that the GA-NHRI rules and the rules for accreditation specify, so this is if you're looking at formally, specify recognition of only one national human rights institution in a country. And again, you know, there's been some variation on that in relation to, for example, to the United Kingdom, where Scottish Human Rights Commission, Northern Ireland, and the UK Human Rights and Equality Commission. So that's and there's the issue of the broad, that accreditation, it requires a broad mandate. So that's one barrier. The second barrier, I think, is to do with resourcing, because I could see a potential for, I'm just looking at APF now. I'm not so sure about GA-NHRI at this stage, but I could see a potential because of the quality of so much of the work that, the APF does. And by this, I mean its members and the Secretariat together, being able to open up. So, for example, GA-NHRI's done a lot, APF's done a lot of work, on women's issues, and has also done a lot of work on sexual orientation and gender identity. And at the regional level, they have brought together civil society organizations to contribute to that process. But, and personally, I can see the potential for inviting for example, women's commissions such as in India or in Indonesia, to join. But it would be it would have to be accepted that it was a different type of membership. Let me put it that way. And I think the barrier, to be honest, at the moment, and I know APF is struggling, is financial, because our members they can't afford big fees. And some of the international donors, I'm pleased, thank goodness, New Zealand's come back to contribute again. For a while it didn't. But, the international donors are not, it's like, they don't think national human rights institutions are so sexy anymore. So it's, yeah, but I think and again, because, as I've said, if you look from 1990 to now, the amazing evolution, I think it's something really worth talking about and exploring, with APF. But probably the way to start is around a specific area, like women or children, because there's quite I don't know, So, but definitely something worth exploring and discussing further.
Sure. I mean, I see point, and I see some work for us in civil society within the country to be able to ask our own government, our own parliamentarians, to allow these institutions to apply for membership. We are not interested in any voting rights. There'll be one vote, and that will go to the NHRC, but at least access to the UN would be possible. Access to trainings would be possible. So we should do a lot of work within our own geographical borders towards that. Thank you, Rosslyn. It was a spread over all the institutions possible. I hope there is a lot of hope that now people get in terms of working with these institutions. Yesterday night there was some hope created. I think this morning there is more hope created. As I come to the 21st day, I'm only interested in hope. I don't want hopelessness to step in. I have today confirmed Justice Madan Lokur, and he said, Henry, what do you want me to speak? I said, can you buy some hope somewhere and supply to all of us? We want hope in our pockets when we close on the 21st day, because hopelessness doesn't lead us anywhere. No. And we need, as citizens, to be hopeful that change is possible, and that change is possible through you and me. And I think that is what Rosslyn did for us today. And we are all grateful to you, without considering the time zone, that you were with us and willingly accepted immediately. And I have already tempted her. And I'll tell others also what the temptation was. In my last letter to her this morning around 6 something was, Rosslyn, would you like to do something after you see us? Would you like to do something for the chairperson and members of our national human rights institutions? They are enjoying lockdown now. We will try to catch them when they are free during lockdown, so that they come to hear about this as well. And then perhaps our state human rights institution chairperson members who are also under lockdown, and whether we can get them for a session. At least that will contribute to opening their thought processes about what national human rights and state human rights institutions are. Thank you very much, Rosslyn. I'll wait for your response on that, and then we will see how we will take that forward. But we never give up hope. We never give up hope like you. We know what a strong woman you are, and we derive a lot of strength from people like you. I want to say that in public. I derive strength from every one of my compatriots, and it is people like you who keep us going. People say a lot of things about us, but it is because of our solidarity that we hold hands so strongly across borders. And for many of us, for our participants to understand that people like you, and I'm sorry I'm saying it in front of you, but it's a learning, and therefore I have to say it. It is that simplicity and that trust and belief in equality that all of you possess, that we also need in our country. We need to feel equal. We need our commissioners to feel equal with us. Yesterday's commissioners whom our people sought are different, but the commissioners whom they see sitting in their commissions, in our commissions, are different. And therefore we need to experience that belief and practice inequality. And that is something very, very special, Rosslyn, in you, which moves us. And she said a number of things about Annie. She forgot to say one important thing about Annie. She's one of Annie's advisors as well. And if Annie is doing well these days, it's because we get very, very sane advice from Rosslyn, and we are moving forward. Thank you very much. Not holding you, friends, a minute more. I have to rush to court. I have an online case today on the postponement of the 10th standard exams in Tamil Nadu. At 11 o'clock, it is being heard, and therefore I have to be there in court. Again, the court is online.